Namaskar, Nileshok here. In this episode, we are going to look at the Purva Paksha of various dating claims for the year of the Mahabharata War. Let us quickly look at the agenda. In this episode, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of Purva Paksha and its specific application to the dating of the Mahabharata War. In future episodes, we will look at the scientific method and its comparison with the Indian Darshana system, Darshana method. And then before jumping into the evidence of the Mahabharata text or my original research related to the dating of the Mahabharata, I would like to walk everyone through this illustration of the scientific progress, the theory of cosmology, the best and most successful scientific theory in the history of the modern science, last 500, 600 years. And then use that as an intuition engine to show the parallels with what I have done in dating the Mahabharata. Then actual evidence and how it led to that specific year of the Mahabharata War, that 5561 BC. Then in the next part, sixth part, we will look at the multidisciplinary evidence that decisively supports that 5561 BCE claim. And then in the last part, we will look at common objections and their scientific and logical refutation. Purva Paksha in general refers to understanding, representing opponent's position, opponent's argument. It is done from the opponent's perspective. It involves building a deep familiarity with the opponent's point of view before criticizing it. In many Indian ancient texts, what you will see is that the writer of that text first will do such a beautiful Purva Paksha, almost you'll be convinced that that is the right position and as if there are no objections. However, then the person will turn the table, so to say, and will start finding objections, start finding holes into the arguments of the opponent, and then will establish one's own position. So there is a Mandan of the opponent's position, and then there is a Khandan of the opponent's position, and then there is a Mandan of one's own position. Okay. The Purva Paksha approach has been used by Adi Shankaracharya, for example, as well as Ramanuja, and this is a very old tradition going back in deep antiquity, thousands and thousands of years. In fact, entire ancient Indian narratives are essentially in this dialogue form. They may not always be debates, but the knowledge is gained through a question and answer process. The Mahabharata. Let us look at what are the existing claims and what is the range for these claims. There are more than 130 different claims by those many different researchers for the year of the Mahabharata War. And broadly speaking, we can define those over the range starting with 400 CE, that is almost in our times, only 1600 years ago, all the way to 7300 BCE, Mahabharata War, but we will get to that in a minute. For example, Professor Hopkins of Harvard University, say about 50 or 100 years ago, claimed that the Mahabharata text came into being in 400 CE. Remember, he's referring to the existence or coming into being of the text of Mahabharata. He's not referring at all to any historical event of the Mahabharata War. And you will find that as a common theme for practically everyone in this particular bracket. Let's look at the next bracket that runs from approximately, say, 800 BCE through 1400 BCE. Predominantly, many archaeologists, many Indian archaeologists fall into this bracket. For example, some of them, such as, say, Professor B.B. Lal, he archaeologically explored certain areas of places such as Kurukshetra, Hastinapur, Indraprastha, which is now Delhi or New Delhi, and Mathura. Now, this he did about, say, 70 years ago or so. And when they found certain objects, they dated those objects, dated those civilizational layers by the techniques available in those times. And then assumed that the dating of those objects, because those places are or were the same places that are mentioned in the Mahabharata, for example. Therefore, someone such as Professor B.B. Lal took that dating as synonymous with the dating of the Mahabharata War. Now, there was no comparison, no corroboration between what he or his team found in these places versus whatever is described in the Mahabharata text. However, in his judgment, he felt if there was an evidence of human habitation in these places, such as Kurukshetra, Mathura, Hastinapur, and Indraprastha, which is now Delhi, then that should be immediately must be understood as referring to the timing of Mahabharata. And even when the descriptions have no correspondence whatsoever, he justified it by saying that the descriptions of the Mahabharata must be exaggerated. And so he was happy. I mean, it was sufficient for him that there was some human habitation in these places, and that could be dated, at least the places where he or his team happened to do some archaeological digging. And that was that. In fact, there are a few other Mahabharata researchers in this bracket who have not necessarily relied on the archaeology, but they have taken some selective references from the Mahabharata text, very few and selective, say such as astronomy references. Then some of them will take some references from Puranas, including Professor B.B. Lal. And it's not very clear why they chose certain Puranas and why they chose certain references. But they did not see any inconsistency in doing this. Let's look at the third approach. In this bracket, that is from 1400 BCE through 2500 BCE, there are a good number of Mahabharata researchers. Now, sometime they looked at archaeology evidence. Sometime they looked at the evidence of certain technologies, such as presence of iron or iron and whatnot. And in some cases, they selectively made use of some astronomy references from the Mahabharata text. In a very arbitrary fashion, they made use of some references from the Puranas if those references happen to support them in justifying a date that fell between 1400 BCE through 2500 BCE. There are many individuals in this particular bracket. Of course, the biggest one, where you have close to 60, maybe even 70 different Mahabharata researchers, And guess what? Those 60 or 70 plus Mahabharata researchers have proposed dates that fall between this very narrow interval of 3000 BCE plus minus 100 years. Something very interesting. And one of the common theme is the assumption of the beginning of a Kali Yuga, that per tradition, and this is not a universal Indian tradition, but definitely we have evidence of it in the sense that 3000 BCE or 3102 BCE is employed as the reference point for most of our Indian calendars. And there are some references in Puranas that with some jugglery can be justified for 3000 BCE. Having said that, as far as the evidence from the Mahabharata text itself is concerned, it is important to point out that there is not even a single set of evidence, either from astronomy, either from archaeology perspective, either from hydrology perspective, from climatology perspective, from physical anthropology perspective, you name it. There is not even a single discipline of science that one can imagine where a reference from the Mahabharata text can be used and then can be objectively tested to arrive at 3000 BCE plus minus 100 years. In fact, I assert that there is not even a single set of evidence of any kind in the Mahabharata text that will allow anyone to arrive at 3000 BCE plus minus 1000 years. So what I'm saying is no evidence of the Mahabharata text can be ever employed to arrive at an estimate for the year of Mahabharata War that would fall anywhere between 4000 BCE to 2000 BCE. It's very important to know that, especially considering that the majority of the Mahabharata researchers are in this very narrow bracket of 3000 BC plus minus 100 years. The next bracket, very few researchers, that is around 5000 BC plus minus 300 years. And let me mention the last one, which is 7300 BCE. This was proposed by a great Indian astronomer, S.B. Dikshit, more than 100 years ago, 125 years ago. I must qualify this particular claim because it's not a very strong claim of S.B. Dikshit. Rather, this was the outcome, a suggested outcome by S.B. Dikshit when he was critiquing another claim from this 5000 BC plus minus 300 years. Okay, so what S.B. Dikshit suggested there is that if we have to use the logic of this other researcher who had actually proposed 5228 BCE, then Shankar Balakrishna Dikshit suggested that if at all that date has to be accepted as a reasonably acceptable date, then it's better that person makes certain assumptions, which of course change the date to about 7000 BCE. Namaskar.